My name is Mace Cole, and 2 months ago, my family voted me out of the company I helped build their voices cold as the glass doors I walk through. They thought the clients I'd won across the Middle East would never notice I was gone, but they didn't expect the $5 million deal to start crumbling without me. The air in Los Angeles that morning carried the faint tang of eucalyptus and car exhaust, a scent that clung like an uninvited memory. I was 15 minutes early, as always, my heels clicking sharp against the polished concrete of the Vera Trade lobby, my key card buzzing green at the glass doors of the main conference suite, a sound so familiar it felt like my own pulse. I smoothed my blazer, not for vanity, but for purpose, my hands needing something to hold on to, before stepping into what I thought would be routine. I expected the usual, a prep session, quarterly reports, maybe some talk about the Dubai rollout. What I didn't expect was the weight of their silence, heavy and rehearsed, waiting for me inside. They were already seated the room, a study in sterile precision. A long mahogany table gleamed under soft halogen lights, the air conditioning humming low, indifferent, the faint scent of lemon cleaner lingering as if the space had been scrubbed of humanity. My father Vernon sat at the head, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm against the armrest, each tap a metronome of judgment. My older sister Callista slouched, slightly scrolling through her phone with that practiced nonchalance that made you feel like an interruption just by existing. Serena from HR sat rigid, her posture tight as a power cord, her eyes fixed on some invisible point above my head. And there at the far end was one empty seat. Mine. I slid into it, careful, quiet, the leather chair creaking faintly under my weight. I straightened my blazer again, a reflex, a shield. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked at me. The silence wasn't confusion. It was choreography. We're not going to dance around this. Vernon began, his voice flat, colder than anger, cutting through the air like a blade. He didn't greet me, didn't ask how I was. This isn't a planning session. It's a realignment discussion. Realignment. 8 years of navigating boardrooms, of saving deals in Doha and Riyadh, had taught me that when power speaks in euphemisms, you're already being erased. I blinked, my mind scrambling to catch up. What vote? I asked, my voice steady but thin, testing the air. Vernon leaned back, clasping his hands like a judge passing sentence. There was a vote last week, he said. The executive team and the board agreed it's time for a change. Streamlined, fresh energy. He looked at me not with regret, but with expectation, as if I'd nod and thank him for the clarity of his delivery. Callista didn't look up from her phone. You weren't on the email, she said, her voice light, almost musical, like she was commenting on the weather. Must have slipped through. It's been buggy lately. She smiled at her screen, not at me, and I felt something snap inside, not loud but final. I laughed once dryly, the sound sharp in the sterile room. Buggy, huh? I said. And the silence that followed wasn't discomfort, it was confirmation. They knew what they were doing. Serena cleared her throat, her voice quick, papering over the crack. You're not being let go, Mace, she said. Just repositioned. We're restructuring legacy roles. Legacy roles. The term landed like a stone in my chest. That was what they called the position I'd built, the one that had turned handshakes into contracts because I knew which words couldn't be translated directly. 8 years of my life reduced to a buzzword they thought they could erase. I didn't respond, not out loud. Inside I was screaming, but outside I nodded once, just once, and said, I understand. The words tasted like ash, bitter and dry. I stood before anyone could wrap their pity in more corporate jargon, my heels clicking sharp and final against the tile. I walked out steady, my reflection flickering in the glass walls of the conference room, pale and small, but still upright. They didn't call after me. They didn't look me in the eye. And maybe that was the cruelest part. Not the vote, not the email that slipped through, but the way they let me leave like I'd already been gone. Back at my desk, I sat and stared at the blinking cursor on the client dashboard. Out of reflex, I started drafting a transition summary because professionalism was still muscle memory even when you're bleeding. But before I could finish the second sentence, my screen froze. Session expired. I tried to log back in. My password no longer worked. I called IT, my voice calm, almost robotic. The response was just as mechanical. Your access has been terminated by a senior administrator. We were not given details. I thanked them anyway. That's what people like me do, even when the ground's falling away. I packed my things, slowly, deliberately, just the essentials. A framed photo of the Dubai launch, a leather notebook filled with handwritten cultural annotations, a marble paperweight from Muscat. Everything else could stay, could rot, could belong to whoever they thought could replace me. In the elevator, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My reflection in the mirrored walls looked like a stranger, pale but steady eyes, dark with something I couldn't name. They didn't even look me in the eye, I whispered the words, hanging unanswered in the air. Walking through the lobby felt like crossing a stage after the curtain had fallen. No one looked up. The receptionist, who used to ask about my weekend, stared at her screen like I was a ghost. Maybe I was. Maybe I'd been fading for longer than I'd realized. Outside, the afternoon light hit the glass building at an angle that warped my reflection into something unrecognizable, a funhouse version of the woman I thought I was. I held my cardboard box tighter, its edges digging into my palms, and kept walking. The air smelled like early spring faint jasmine undercut by the sharp bite of exhaust. My phone buzzed in my pocket, an unknown number, international prefix, and Arabic country code. I stared at it for a second too long, my thumb hovering over the screen. I didn't answer. Not yet. I wasn't ready to hear what was on the other end, wasn't ready to know if it was a lifeline or another goodbye. I slid into my car, the box heavy in the passenger seat, and merged onto the Pacific Coast Highway. The sun was slipping toward the horizon, casting long gold streaks across the water, making the ocean look like it was burning. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence felt earned, like a bruise you press to remind yourself you're still here. My mind circled back to the meeting, to Vernon's clasped hands, to Callista's smile, to Serena's assurances. They hadn't argued with me, hadn't thanked me. They'd just voted me out like I was a line item they could cut. And the worst part, they thought the clients wouldn't notice. They thought the trust I'd built could be handed off like a folder of notes. I gripped the steering wheel, the leather creaking under my fingers. The coastline blurred past, but one thought held firm: they hadn't just replaced me. They'd erased me. And maybe that's the cruelest kind of exile, the kind that pretends you were never there. I pulled over near Point Doom, the waves crashing below, and stepped out, the ocean wind sharp against my face. The box sat in the car, small but heavy, a monument to what they thought they could discard. I didn't open it. The weight of it was enough to remind me who I was. The Pacific Coast Highway stretched out like a ribbon, unspooling into the dusk. The ocean on my left, churning gold and gray, under a sky that couldn't decide whether to burn or fade. I drove with the windows down, the air, sharp with salt, and the faint sweetness of kelp letting it sting my face. The cardboard box sat in the passenger seat, its edges worn from where my hands had gripped it too tightly, a silent passenger, heavier than it had any right to be. I didn't look at it. I didn't need to. It held the remnants of 8 years at Viratrade, 8 years of deals. I'd saved handshakes I'd earned and a notebook that mapped more than just contracts. It held the weight of what they'd thrown away. My phone buzzed again, the same international number, the Arabic country code, glowing like a question I wasn't ready to answer. I let it go to voicemail, the silence in the car louder than the waves outside. I pulled into a turnout near Zuma Beach, the tires crunching on gravel, and killed the engine. The ocean roared below, relentless, like it was trying to drown out the echo of my father's voice in that conference room. Realignment, streamlined, fresh energy, words that sounded like progress but felt like a blade. I stepped out the wind, tugging at my blazer, and leaned against the hood of the car, still warm from the drive. The horizon was a bruise purple and gold, and for a moment I let myself feel the ache of it all. Not just the vote, not just Callista's smug smile, but the way they'd looked right through me like I was already gone. I whispered to the wind. They thought I'd disappear quietly. The waves didn't answer, but they didn't need to. Their rhythm was enough a reminder that some things endure, even when you try to erase them. Back in the car, I drove on the highway, curving through Malibu, past houses perched on cliffs, like they were daring the ocean to take them. My mind rewound to the week before, to the executive lounge where Callista had stood in her white-on-white outfit, looking more like an Instagram influencer than a director. She'd flipped to a slide titled, "The New Face of Viratrade." her voice bright with that rehearsed confidence she always wore like a badge. "We need to rethink how we present ourselves to the Middle East," she'd said. "Less protocol, more connection, warmth, energy. Let's not get bogged down in cultural subtext." She'd smiled right at me then, a smile that said, she knew something I didn't. I mean, they're businessmen. They want deals, not history lessons. Vernon had chuckled a low rumble of approval. "Valora," my mother had murmured. "That's my girl." Her voice soft but sharp like a needle threading through silk. I hadn't said a word, not out of fear, but because I'd learned early that silence could cut deeper than argument. Still, it stung. 8 years of studying etiquette, of rewriting contracts to honor the untranslatable, of building trust that didn't come with a title, they were rewriting it as overcomplication. My first mistake was not defending myself. My second was thinking they'd ever seen me at all. The highway blurred past the lights of Santa Monica, winking in the distance. My phone buzzed again this time, a text, not a call. No contact save just a number I recognized from the office. Destry. "You didn't deserve what they did," it read. "They'll learn the hard way." No emojis, no follow-up, just those words stark and sure, like a stone dropped into still water. I didn't reply, not because I was cold, but because some messages don't need an answer, they just need to be held. I saved the contact as D. Quiet Witness, and something in me steadied like a compass finding north. Destry had been there across from me in those high-pressure meetings, taking notes, seeing everything. She'd seen Callista cut me off mid-sentence, seen Vernon nod like it was nothing seen, the slow erasure begin long before I had. People don't always have to shout to stand beside you. Sometimes they just stay. Back at my apartment, I carried the box inside, setting it on the kitchen counter under the single pendant light that cast a warm circle in the dim room. The rest of the space was dark, the kind of dark that feels like it's listening. I poured a glass of wine, not because I wanted it, but because I needed something to hold that wasn't a grudge. The leather notebook sat on the table, its spine soft from years of use, the corners frayed like an old friend who'd weathered too many storms. I opened it, the pages creaking faintly, and traced the lines of handwritten notes, English and Arabic, side-by-side phrases that didn't just translate words, but carried meaning across borders. Coffee stains dotted the edges, ink bled through some pages, but every line was a memory of a deal saved, a trust earned. I flipped to a page marked with a folded corner, Riyadh Clause Revision 2021. I could still see that night the hotel room in Saudi Arabia, the glow of my laptop as I rewrote a contract to avoid a cultural misstep. One sentence, poorly translated, had implied a power imbalance. I'd caught it, rewritten it, with the Arabic concept of wajibat al-ikhtiyariya, the honor of voluntary responsibility. The deal closed the next day. They never asked how I'd done it. They just assumed it was handled like trust was part of the furniture. I turned to another page, Doha, Oman, a scribbled note about dinner etiquette in Jeddah. Each entry was a piece of a bridge I'd built not just between Veritrade and its clients, but between worlds that didn't always understand each other. No one at the company had ever asked, "How did you learn this?" or "What made that client trust you after the fallout?" They thought trust came with the territory, not from the trenches. A memory surfaced sharp and unbidden. Sheikh Hamad's advisor on a late-night call from Dubai, his English clipped but warm. "Miss Cole," he'd said, "your clarity protects our honor. That is why we listen to you." I'd thanked him then, not knowing those words would mean more now than any title ever could. I closed the notebook, my fingers lingering on the cover, and felt something shift. Not anger, not yet resolve, but a quiet clarity, like the first deep breath after a long dive. The phone lit up again, the same international number. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to hear what they wanted, wasn't ready to know if it was an apology or a demand. I turned it off completely, the screen going dark, and walked to the window. Downtown Los Angeles glimmered in the distance, a grid of lights that looked both familiar and foreign. My reflection hovered in the glass, not broken, just waiting. I thought of Callista's slide, the new face of Viratrade, and the way she'd smiled like she could erase me with a PowerPoint. They weren't just replacing me. They were erasing the idea that I'd ever mattered. But the notebook on the table, The coffee stains, the Arabic script, they were proof I had. Proof that some things can't be streamlined, can't be voted out. I sat back down, the wine untouched, and opened my laptop. A LinkedIn notification popped up, a post from ViraTrade. Meet the future of our leadership. A filtered photo of Callista in the center, flanked by department heads. Vernon standing proud to the side. My name wasn't in the caption. It wasn't anywhere. I stared at it, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat, and whispered to no one. They replaced me before they removed me. The ocean wind rattled the window, and I closed the laptop. I wasn't plotting revenge. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was watching. And sometimes watching is more dangerous than speaking. The box sat on the counter, still unopened, a small monument to what they thought they could discard. I didn't need to unpack it. Not yet. The weight of it was enough to remind me who I was. The morning light spilled through my apartment window, sharp and unyielding, cutting across the kitchen counter where the cardboard box still sat unopened like a silent accusation. It had been 3 weeks since I'd walked out of ViraTrade's glass doors, 3 weeks since my father's voice had flattened my 8 years of work into a single word realignment. I'd stopped checking my phone for apologies that never came, stopped replaying Callista's smile or Serena's tight-lipped assurances. But the quiet wasn't surrender, it was surveillance. I sipped my coffee, black and bitter, and opened my laptop. The screen glowed with a shared calendar link I'd been accidentally left on, a glitch in their system that felt like fate. ViraTrade's quarterly call with the Emirati client was scheduled for today, the kind of call I used, to lead pacing in flats with a scarf draped over my shoulders, contracts memorized cultural cues, ready like a second language. This time, it wouldn't be my voice welcoming them. It would be Callista's. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking faintly, and let the thought settle. Callista, with her white-on-white outfits and her slides about connection and energy, thought she could step into my role like it was a pair of heels she could borrow. But trust isn't a PowerPoint. It's not a buzzword you can fake in a boardroom. My phone buzzed, the same international number that had called the day I left the Arabic country code, persistent as a heartbeat. This time I didn't hesitate. I tapped call back, and the line rang once, twice, before a voice answered, familiar and sure. "Miss Cole," he said, his tone warm but edged with urgency. "We were hoping it was you." The words landed like a key turning in a lock. I listened, my pen scratching notes on a legal pad, and by the end of the call, I knew what was coming. Their $5 million deal was unraveling threads, pulling loose, because no one at ViraTrade understood the fabric of trust I'd woven. They needed me, not the company. Me. I didn't smile. I didn't feel triumph, not yet. I felt the weight of clarity, cold and precise like a scalpel. I opened my email and began typing each word deliberate, each sentence a line in the sand. Subject proposal, Mace Cole, conditional cooperation. 3 lines, clear, non-negotiable, independent consultant status, full autonomy in client communication and negotiation, temporary contract, non-renewable, non-trainable, non-transferable. I added one final sentence. If there is agreement on these terms, I am available for 1 quarter. Nothing beyond that will be assumed or implied. I hit send before I could soften it, the click of the mouse louder than it should have been in the quiet room. 5 minutes later, I called Destry. "I sent it," I said, before she could say hello. "You sure?" she asked, her voice calm but curious, like she was testing the air. "I'm not doing this to prove anything," I replied. "They need help, but this time they're paying for the clarity they ignored." She gave a low, almost proud exhale. "Good fences make good neighbors, huh?" I smiled, the first real smile in weeks. Robert Frost would have made a hell of a negotiator. The Zoom link arrived that afternoon, buried in a curt email from Serena meeting, scheduled for Monday 9 a.m. All senior team members present. No mention of my terms, no pleasantries, just the bare bones of obligation. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The silence was my signature. Monday morning, I sat in my home office, coffee warm beside me, hair pulled back tight, my laptop screen casting a blue glow across the room. The Zoom grid populated slowly, each face a piece of the puzzle I'd left behind. Vernon adjusted his tie, his jaw set like he was bracing for a storm. Callista positioned herself like she was staging a press conference, her navy blazer crisp, her smile too bright for the occasion. A junior associate, Aaron, fumbled with his notepad, looking like he'd wandered into the wrong room. They'd gone all out the Veratrade conference room, dressed up like a showroom, gold-rimmed tea sets, a platter of dried fruits, a projector looping their logo with a new tagline: modern, forward, fluent. I almost laughed. It looked like a pitch for a lifestyle brand, not a $5 million renewal with the most culturally sensitive client portfolio they'd ever had. The Emirati delegation logged on early, their faces calm but unreadable, and the air on Veratrade's side shifted a ripple of unease. Vernon cleared his throat to start, but the lead delegate spoke first, his voice level, his accent precise. "I'm sorry," he said. "We expected to speak with Miss Cole." The words landed like a stone in still water, and Callista blinked, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Of course," she said, recovering quickly, her voice sugar-sweet. "I've been leading on our end, happy to walk you through everything." Her hands gripped the table's edge, betraying her polish. "We're fully aligned on what you need." She turned to Aaron, who looked like he'd rather vanish. "This is Aaron, our key liaison with the legal review." The delegate nodded politely, then glanced at his notes. "We received a message from Al-Kazim," he said. "I believe you sent a follow-up." Aaron nodded, his voice unsteady. "Yes, we, sent over the clarification." The delegate paused, his gaze steady. The phrasing implied obligation on his part alone. Vernon shifted in his seat. "There must have been a misunderstanding," he said, but Aaron, in a moment of fatal honesty, admitted it was translated via Google. The silence that followed was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room. I felt my breath catch, but I didn't speak. My contract required me to engage only when addressed, and I held to it, my camera on my face neutral. The delegate switched to Arabic, his words short and sharp, and I felt the tension crack across the screen. Then a senior advisor, her expression soft but firm, spoke in English. "May we ask, is Miss Cole present?" I unmuted, my voice calm, steady. "Yes, I am. Please go ahead." Callista's neck stiffened, but I didn't look at her. I looked at the clients. "We acknowledge the phrasing confusion," I said, switching to Arabic mid-sentence, the words flowing like water over stone. "We've reverted to the original structure. I've reviewed the draft personally and ensured every term honors the spirit of partnership." There was a beat of silence, then the delegate nodded once. "Thank you. We can proceed." The meeting continued, not quickly, but smoothly. I spoke only when asked, translated once, when an idiom misfired, offered a cultural note, when a reference felt too American. When the Q3 rollout slide appeared, the delegate looked directly at the camera and said, "We don't respond to decoration. We respond to continuity." He meant it, and they all heard it. Callista didn't speak again. After the call, my email pinged. "Vernon, of course. Subject, let's debrief. This week sometime. Might be worth rethinking your timeline. Great work today." I read it once, then deleted it, the gesture final, like closing a door. I stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the city, its lights flickering like a pulse. They'd called me back because they had no choice, but I'd returned on my terms, not theirs. The notebook on my desk, its pages worn and stained, was proof of what they couldn't replicate. The deal was safe not because of their logo or their tea sets, but because of me. I didn't need their applause. I didn't need their gratitude. I needed the clarity of knowing I was indispensable, not to them, but to the work I'd built. The phone buzzed again, Destry this time. A screenshot of a LinkedIn comment under Callista's post about the meeting, written in plain, unmistakable Arabic. "We do not proceed without full cultural assurance." No likes, no replies, but it was there, a crack in their polished facade. I texted back one word: "saw." She replied with a single emoji, a raised eyebrow. I smiled, not because I'd won, but because the truth was starting to speak for itself. The ocean outside my window was dark now, its waves a distant murmur, but I felt its pull, its promise of something vast and unbroken. I wasn't their bridge anymore. I was the builder, and they were just beginning to see what that meant. The Los Angeles skyline shimmered in the late afternoon haze, a grid of glass and steel that caught the light and threw it back, fractured like a promise half kept. I stood by my apartment window, the city sprawling below, and felt the quiet settle over me, not heavy, but deliberate, like the pause before a verdict. It had been 2 days since the Zoom call, 2 days since the Emirati delegate's voice had cut through Veratrade's polished facade with a single sentence. We expected to speak with Miss Cole. 2 days since I'd saved their $5 million deal, not for them, but for the trust I'd built over years they'd tried to erase. My phone lay on the kitchen counter screen dark, but I knew it held a message I hadn't answered yet. A forwarded email from Destry, a screenshot of a LinkedIn post, a whisper of something shifting in the air. I didn't check it. Not yet. I wanted to hold this moment, this clarity, a little longer. The leather notebook sat open on the table, its pages worn. Coffee stained a map of deals and cultures I'd navigated when no one else knew how. I traced a line of Arabic script. A note from a meeting in Muscat honor is not in the words, but in the silence between them. I'd written it years ago, not knowing it would become my own truth. The silence I'd wielded in that Zoom call wasn't surrender, it was power. Callista's smile had faltered. Vernon's tie had seemed too tight, and Aaron's Google Translate confession had hung in the air like a confession of neglect. They'd needed me, not their logo, not their gold-rimmed tea sets. And I delivered on my terms as an independent consultant who owed them nothing beyond the contract I'd set. The phone buzzed, breaking the quiet. Destry again, this time, a text with a screenshot. I picked it up, the screen's glow cold against my palm. It was a post from the Emirati client, not on Veratrade's page, but on their own business consortium's private board, written in elegant Arabic. I read it slowly, translating in my head. Without her, we would not have trusted your firm again. We commend Miss Cole. Cultural trust is personal, not corporate. No hashtags, no flair. Just the truth, stark and unshakable. I whispered aloud, my name, and felt it settle in my chest. Not as triumph, but as relief, the kind that steadies your spine. I texted Destry back saw. She replied with a single word, good. No more was needed. Some truths don't require commentary, they just need to be seen. I walked to the counter, poured a glass of water, and let the coolness ground me. The cardboard box was gone, now tucked into a closet, its contents no longer a wound, but a reminder. I didn't need to carry it anymore. The weight had shifted, not to my shoulders, but to theirs. Veratrade's walls were bending, and I could feel it across the city. Callista's LinkedIn post from the day of the call had been a glossy, wonderful session with our valued partners in the Gulf. She'd posed by the boardroom table, tagging Vernon a few account managers, but not the client, not me. The comments beneath it told a different story. One, in plain English, had stopped me cold. We do not proceed without full cultural assurance. It had no likes, no replies, but it lingered, a crack in their narrative that grew wider with every view. The post vanished by noon, deleted, but not forgotten. The internet doesn't forgive, and neither does trust. That evening, I drove to the Veratrade office not to beg, but to end it. The building loomed against the twilight, its glass facade reflecting the last streaks of orange in the sky. I'd requested a meeting not with Vernon or Callista, but with the board, a formality to close my contract. Destry came with me, her briefcase in hand, her presence a quiet punctuation. We stepped into the boardroom, the same one where they'd voted me out weeks ago. The table gleamed, the air conditioning hummed, but the room felt smaller now, less imposing. Vernon sat at the head, his hands clasped his face, unreadable. Callista stood by the projector, her scarf draped just so mid-sentence about transitional success planning. The screen glowed with bullet points, legacy mapping, scalable trust models. Empty words hollow as the chairs around the table. Halfway through her slide, the AV system pinged. An external participant had joined uninvited. The voice came through before the video loaded, calm, direct. We weren't informed this was a closed-door meeting, the Emirati delegate said. We wanted to be clear before any realignment takes place. All eyes darted to the screen. Callista's smile froze a crack in her veneer. We signed because of Miss Cole, he continued. Not the firm, not the logo, not the family name. Her. If she steps away, the partnership dissolves. The silence was deafening, not discomfort, but reckoning. Destry glanced at me, her eyes steady, but I was already moving. I pulled a sealed envelope from my bag labeled in my own hand and slid it across the table, slow, deliberate. Inside was everything my formal withdrawal notice completion of deliverables, a handover timeline, and one handwritten note on top. I returned to protect the deal, not the structure. Callista opened her mouth, but Destry spoke first. As her legal counsel, she said her voice. Even I confirm that Mace's contract is fulfilled. She has no further obligations to this company. Per her agreement, client communication will now transfer directly to her as an independent consultant should they choose. Vernon didn't speak. Callista tried her voice thin. But we were just finalizing a knowledge transfer. I stood cutting through her words without raising my voice. You can't contain someone who's not trying to stay, I said. No yelling, no slamming doors. I nodded, once then walked out, Destry at my side, our heels echoing across the marble lobby like the last words of a story they'd never controlled. Outside, the evening air was soft, carrying the faint scent of jasmine and asphalt. My phone lit up with a notification, subject Joint Expansion Strategy Dubai region. Sender Mason Trent. I hadn't spoken to him in 2 years, not since a conference in Abu Dhabi, where he'd taken notes on everything but the happy hour. The email was brief, professional, but the last line stopped me. They requested you by name. I didn't smile, but I felt something better than satisfaction. Freedom, sharp and clean, like the first breath after a storm. I slipped the phone into my pocket and kept walking the city lights stretching wide a canvas I was ready to paint. The next morning I sat at Kleinoscope, a co-working hub downtown with concrete floors and plants in impossible corners. The hum of laptops and coffee grinders filled the space, a rhythm of creation that felt like mine. Mason had just stepped out for a call when my phone buzzed again. Another screenshot from Destry this time, a public post from the Emirati client on LinkedIn. We commend Miss Cole. Cultural trust is personal, not corporate. It spread faster than I could track comments piling up from former colleagues, clients, even reporters I'd dodged at conferences. You deserve this. Finally, she was always the glue. I didn't repost. It didn't comment. I didn't need to. My silence wasn't empty. It echoed where it mattered. Vernon didn't call. Callista didn't email. But I could feel their tension across the city, their structure cracking under the weight of what they'd ignored. I opened my laptop, a new folder labeled Continuity, and began drafting a proposal for Mason's project. The words came easily, not because I was proving something, but because I was building something. Not for them, not anymore. For me. The ocean outside the window was a distant murmur, but I felt its pull, its vastness. I wasn't their bridge. I was the architect, and the world was starting to see the difference. The phone buzzed one last time, a DC area code, probably another offer. I let it ring, the sound fading into the hum of the room, and kept typing. The story wasn't over, but this chapter was mine. The fog hung low over Palisades Park, softening the edges of the world, the ocean below, a wide, unbothered expanse that didn't care about the weight I'd carried or the weight I'd set down. I walked the path alone, headphones looping an instrumental track I'd forgotten I loved its notes, weaving through the morning like a thread pulling me forward. Los Angeles was waking up in the distance, cars humming, lights flickering through the mist, but I was in my own current, steady, unhurried. In my jacket pocket, an envelope from Valora, my mother pressed against the leather notebook I'd carried from Muscat to Doha to Riyadh. I hadn't opened it yet. Not because I was afraid, but because some things need to wait until you're ready to let them land. The city moved behind me, indifferent, and I kept walking the waves below, whispering something I was finally ready to hear. It had been a week since I'd walked out of Veratrade's boardroom, the sealed envelope I'd slid across their table, a quiet detonation. My formal withdrawal, my deliverables, my handwritten note, I returned to protect the deal, not the structure, had said everything I needed to. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was final, like the click of a lock you don't plan to reopen. Back at my apartment that evening, I'd found Valora's letter in my mailbox, her cursive looping across the envelope like it wanted to pretend this was personal. I'd opened it on a bench near the bluff, the waves crashing below, and read the single sentence centered on the page. If I hadn't doubted you, then maybe you'd still be here. I didn't protect you, and I regret that. No apology, just regret the kind that admits you were right, but arrives too late to matter. I folded it back into thirds, tucked it beside my notebook, and let the ocean breeze rinse the moment clean. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. Some hurts heal by staying still, and I was done running from mine. The Kaleidoscope co-working hub downtown was alive with the hum of creation laptops clicking, coffee grinding, quiet meetings tucked into glass pods. I sat at a corner table, the concrete floor cool beneath my feet plants, in impossible corners, softening the edges of the space. No one here knew the Mace who'd walked out of Veratrade's glass doors, only the one I was becoming. My laptop screen glowed with the opening slide of a keynote deck, the title Clean and Minimal Cultural Trust in Global Infrastructure. Below it, a quote I'd saved from a voice memo sent at midnight 6 months ago by Sheikh Hamad. Her judgment protects honor beyond numbers. I'd kept it private, stored in the safest pocket of my pride, but now it sat on the first slide not as a boast, but as a conclusion. I played the recording once more, his voice calm, sure like he was stating a fact about the weather. I didn't rehearse. I just listened, letting the words remind me who I was. Mason Trent slid into the chair across from me, 2 coffees in hand, his eyes sharp but steady. "You ready for final export?" he asked, nodding at my screen. "Yeah," I said. "Let's lock it." He turned to his own laptop, but I didn't move. I stared at my reflection in the black glass of the screen, the version of me who'd left Veratrade no longer bitter, just certain. "You never know which seeds will bloom," I said, mostly to myself. "But when they do, it's loud, even in silence." Mason glanced over, his brow raised, but he didn't ask. The right people don't need the backstory to know which moment matters. My phone buzzed, a DC area code I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail, the sound swallowed by the hum of the room. An email followed the subject line, stopping me cold. Project retainer. Consulting opportunity. It was from a firm I knew too well, one that had reached out the week after I left Veratrade, their Gulf contracts in shambles, their strategy crumbling. They offered double my rate, unlimited autonomy, access to all past client data if I'd clean up their mess. I hadn't responded, then hadn't forwarded it to Destry, hadn't even told Mason. I left it sitting in my inbox, an unopened apology I didn't need. I wasn't here to fix their failures. I was here to build something new. At Clinoscope, we were designing pipelines that scaled with cultural nuance baked into the foundation, real impact, not marketing fluff. I closed the email and opened a new file, South Asia expansion, the contact list, topped by a name I hadn't seen in 3 years, Anish Rao, Mumbai. He'd remembered me, not Veratrade, me. Destry's text came later that afternoon, a link to Veratrade's quarterly report. I clicked it, expecting their usual PR spin, but found only a blank space under Middle East activity. No data, no revenue, no renewals. I whispered to the empty room, "Your worth isn't proven by who hires you. It's confirmed by who can't replace you." I closed the tab, stood and stretched the city outside, moving in its relentless rhythm. Veratrade's bridge wasn't just cracked, it was gone, and I wasn't looking back to rebuild it. Friday morning arrived with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I was 2 coffees deep, halfway through a review with Mason's team, when my cursor hovered over the keynote deck's final slide. The summit was a month away, a room of CEOs, trade consultants, and diplomats waiting to hear what I'd learned in the trenches. I clicked to the last slide, a single line. "The biggest revenge is being remembered after they tried to replace you." I didn't need to name Veratrade. The industry already knew their failures, whispered in conference hallways and LinkedIn threads. The applause at the summit didn't erupt. It built slow and steady, from the front rows to the corners, the kind that starts because people are still processing what hit them. I stepped off the stage without bowing my heels, steady on the polished floor. At the hotel that night, I changed out of my blazer, pulled my hair into a knot, and sat by the window with a mug of tea, steam curling in the air. The San Francisco fog rolled in from the bay, soft and slow, wrapping the city in a hush. My phone pinged an email from the summit organizers. International Client Forum confirmed. "You're headlining." I let out a small laugh, not from surprise, but from the grace of timing. A child's voice echoed in my memory, a little girl in Palisades Park tugging her mother's sleeve. She looks like a CEO. I hadn't corrected her then, hadn't needed to. The world was starting to see what I'd always known. Another email arrived forwarded from Destry. Unfortunately, due to a lack of cultural continuity and leadership visibility, we will not be renewing. Veratrade had lost another client. I didn't read the body, just forwarded it to Destry with a subject line. Told you. Her reply was instant, took long enough. I smiled, clicked into the South Asia expansion file, and kept working. The tea cooled in my hand, the city outside a blur of light and shadow. My phone vibrated one last time, a notification from the Middle East delegation, direct consultation requested with Miss Cole. Not my firm, not my family's name. Me. I turned the phone off the screen, fading to black, and leaned back in my chair. The fog pressed against the window, and I felt it, the architecture of freedom, built not on their terms, but mine. The story wasn't over, but this chapter was closed, and the next one was already writing itself.